The station orbited the Viridian hunting grounds like a steel moon, its lights reflecting off the planet's purple atmosphere below. Inside the main docking bay, Taewon knelt beside a damaged shuttle, his hands black with grease as he worked on the engine panel. He was 32 years old, average height, with short black hair that stuck up in odd directions because he always forgot to comb it after removing his work cap. His coveralls were stained with oil, coolant, and a dozen other fluids that came from fixing ships all day. Around him, the station buzzed with activity. This was no ordinary week at Viridian Station. The Centennial Great Hunt had brought hunters from 12 different species to the preserve below. They walked past Taewon without seeing him, which was fine with him. He preferred being invisible. The hunters were impressive. Some stood 3 meters tall with 4 arms. Others floated through the air, surrounded by glowing energy fields. A few looked like walking crystals, their bodies refracting light into rainbow patterns. They wore expensive armor and carried weapons that cost more than Taewon would earn in his entire lifetime. They spoke in loud voices about their previous conquests, each trying to impress the others with tales of dangerous prey and narrow escapes. Taewon listened while he worked. It was hard not to. The hunters talked constantly, and the docking bay carried sound well. 6 weeks, one hunter said, his voice filled with frustration. The speaker was Crix Valor, a Velthari, whose crystalline body sparkled even in the harsh industrial lighting of the bay. He was the leader of the most successful hunting guild in the galaxy. 6 weeks, and we have found nothing. Not a track, not a scale, nothing. The phantom worm is playing with us, another hunter replied. This one was Bolthun, a Kravik with 6 arms and skin like rough leather. His species never forgot anything they saw or heard. His brain worked like a computer. It knows we are here. It must. Impossible, said a third voice, this one echoing strangely as if coming from underwater. Nemsha floated past, a jellyfish-like creature surrounded by a bubble of liquid. She was a psionic, able to sense thoughts and emotions from kilometers away. I have swept the entire preserve 3 times. The creature's mind should shine like a beacon to me. But there is nothing. It is as if the worm has ceased to exist. Taewon tightened a bolt and reached for his diagnostic tool. The shuttle's owner had complained about power fluctuations. Taewon had found the problem in 10 minutes. A loose connection in the fuel line. Simple fix. He wondered if anyone had bothered to check the worm's habitat for simple changes, then pushed the thought away. These were expert hunters. They surely knew what they were doing. Perhaps it has developed new abilities, Crix Valor suggested. His voice carried the weight of someone used to being listened to. Phase shifting. Dimensional displacement. Something beyond our current understanding. The other hunters murmured agreement. They began discussing complex theories involving quantum mechanics and exotic physics. Taewon understood maybe 1 word in 10. He focused on his work instead. More hunters arrived throughout the day, returning from the preserve below. All wore the same expression of frustration and disbelief. The phantom worm had been the prize of the Centennial Hunt for good reason. The creature was 3 centuries old, had bioluminescent scales worth a fortune, and produced a unique enzyme that could cure dozens of diseases. Capturing it would bring wealth, fame, and respect. But first, someone had to find it. The equipment is malfunctioning, a hunter complained loudly as she stomped into the bay. Her name was Kira, and she was human, though heavily augmented with cybernetic enhancements. My sonic disruptors keep giving false readings. My heat sensors show thermal signatures that disappear when I investigate. The gravimetric scanner is completely useless. My psionic amplifiers are also failing, Nemsha added, floating closer. They worked perfectly until we arrived here. Now they function intermittently at best. Taewon glanced up from his work. Equipment malfunctions were his specialty. But these hunters had their own technicians, expensive specialists, who charged more for 1 consultation than Taewon earned in a month. He returned his attention to the shuttle. The days blended together. Tae-1 repaired ships, listened to complaints, and watched the hunters grow more desperate. They doubled their search teams. They brought in additional equipment. They consulted with experts across the galaxy via quantum communication. Nothing worked. By the end of the 6th week, the mood on the station had turned dark. Hunters who had been boastful and confident now moved with slumped shoulders. Arguments broke out over whose fault the failure was. Some hunters accused others of sabotage. Wild theories spread through the station, like infection. Tae-1 kept working. A hunting craft needed new coolant lines. A personal transport had a cracked hull plate. A cargo hauler's landing gear wouldn't extend properly. He fixed them all, one after another, his hands steady and his mind focused on the simple, mechanical problems in front of him. One evening, he was working late when he overheard an argument in the cantina next to the docking bay. The walls were thin. Every word carried clearly. The worm was last seen in the western canyons, Bolthun was saying. His perfect memory, reciting facts. That was 43 days ago. Since then, despite continuous surveillance, advanced tracking technology, and psionic sweeps, we have detected 0 signs of its presence. It must have left the preserve, someone suggested. Impossible, Crix Valor said firmly. The preserve is surrounded by an energy barrier. Nothing larger than a small bird can pass through it. The worm is still here. It must be. Then where? Another hunter demanded. We have searched everywhere. Every canyon, every cave, every forest. We have scanned from orbit. We have deployed drones. We have used every technique known to galactic civilization. The creature has simply vanished. Tae-1 paused in his work, frowning slightly. He pulled out his battered personal datapad. The screen cracked from being dropped too many times. His grease-stained fingers moved across the screen as he looked something up. The Viridian ecosystem. The Western Canyons. The phantom worms' known habits. He read for several minutes, his frown deepening. Then, he shook his head and returned to work. It was not his place to interfere. These were the galaxy's greatest hunters. They knew what they were doing. The next morning, Tae-1 made a decision he would later struggle to explain. Maybe it was because the mystery bothered him. Maybe it was because he had always been unable to leave problems unsolved. Or maybe it was simply because he thought he might have noticed something obvious that everyone else had missed. He waited until the Hunt Council gathered in the observation deck, then approached nervously. The deck overlooked the preserve below. Its windows, offering a spectacular view of purple forests and red canyons. The hunters stood in small groups, their body language defensive and frustrated. Tae-1 cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said quietly. No one turned. He spoke louder. "Not now," Crix Valor interrupted without looking at him. "We are in the middle of an important discussion, but I think I might know. You?" Bolthun turned, his 6 arms crossed in a gesture of dismissal. "You are a mechanic. A maintenance worker. What could you possibly know about hunting? I just thought, your thoughts are not required," Crix Valor said coldly. His crystalline face turned toward Tae-1 for the first time, and his expression was one of pure contempt. "Return to your work, human. Leave the thinking to those qualified to do so." Tae-1 stood there for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "Yes, sir," he said quietly, and turned to leave. As he walked away, he heard one hunter laugh. "Can you imagine? A grease monkey thinking he can help us? Next, the cleaning staff will offer advice." The others joined in the laughter. Tae-1's face burned, but he kept walking. He should have known better than to speak up. He was nobody, just a mechanic who fixed ships. He returned to the docking bay, picked up his tools, and tried to forget about the phantom worm and its impossible disappearance. He had work to do. Real work. The kind that actually mattered. But later that evening, as he lay in his small quarters staring at the ceiling, His mind kept returning to what he had read about the Western Canyons. About the ecosystem. About the one thing that nobody seemed to have checked. The simple thing. The obvious thing. The thing that experts always overlooked because it was too basic to consider. The 7th week of the hunt began with an emergency council meeting. Tae-won heard about it from Hae-jin, his supervisor, in the maintenance department. She was a tough woman in her 50s who had worked on stations her entire life. She ran the docking bay with efficiency and rarely smiled. But she was fair to her workers. The hunt master called everyone together. Hae-jin told Tae-won while they restocked the parts lockers. Even the support staff. He wants ideas. Any ideas? They are getting desperate. Tae-won nodded but said nothing. He had learned his lesson about offering suggestions. The meeting took place in the main conference hall, a large space usually reserved for formal ceremonies. Tae-won attended because Hae-jin insisted all maintenance staff be present. He stood at the back, trying to be invisible among the crowd. Krix Valor stood at the front, his crystalline body catching the light dramatically. Despite the circumstances, he maintained his commanding presence. "We face an unprecedented situation," he announced. "The phantom worm has eluded the greatest hunters in galactic history for 7 weeks. This is unacceptable. I am opening the floor to any and all suggestions, regardless of source." Hands shot up. Voices called out. The suggestions came rapid fire, each more elaborate than the last. Perhaps the worm has developed quantum entanglement abilities and exists in multiple locations simultaneously. Maybe it has learned to mask its biological signature using the preserve's magnetic field. Could it have achieved a state of temporal displacement, moving slightly out of sync with normal time? What if it has formed a symbiotic relationship with a psionic parasite that shields its thoughts? The theories grew increasingly complex and exotic. Each speaker seemed determined to prove their intelligence by suggesting something more elaborate than the previous idea. Krix Valor listened to them all, his expression growing more frustrated with each suggestion. Tae-won listened too, and the more he heard, the more convinced he became that everyone was thinking in the wrong direction. They were all looking for complicated explanations because they were complicated thinkers. None of them considered that the answer might be simple. After an hour, Krix Valor dismissed the meeting. Nothing useful had emerged. The hunters filed out, talking among themselves in low, discouraged voices. Tae-won returned to work. A cargo ship needed its docking clamps recalibrated. He gathered his tools and headed to the assigned berth. While he worked, a shadow fell across his workspace. "You had something to say yesterday." Tae-won looked up. The speaker was young, perhaps mid-20s, with an unusual appearance. He had crystalline features like the Velthari, but with human skin tone and black hair. His eyes were dark instead of the typical Velthari light refraction patterns. A hybrid. Then, half human, half Velthari. "I am Ji-Hoo," the young man said. "I saw you try to speak to the council yesterday. What did you want to tell them?" Tae-won hesitated. "It does not matter. I am just a mechanic. So? Maybe a mechanic's perspective is exactly what we need." Ji-Hoo sat down on a cargo crate, clearly intending to wait. Everyone else has failed. Ji-Hoo. All. Ji-Hoo. 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 What is the harm in listening to someone different? Tae-won set down his tools and wiped his hands on his coveralls. "I do not know if I am right, but I think everyone is looking in the wrong place, or rather, looking for the wrong thing." "Explain." "The worm was last seen in the Western Canyons 6 weeks ago, correct?" Ji-Hoo nodded. "And since then, all the scanning equipment has been malfunctioning. Sonic disruptors, heat sensors, psionic amplifiers. Everything gives false readings or stops working entirely." "Yes. We believe the worm has developed some kind of defensive jamming ability." Tae-won shook his head. "What if it is not the worm causing the malfunctions? What if it is the equipment itself? Think about it. You have dozens of hunters all using high-frequency scanners, gravimetric sensors, psionic amplifiers, and other advanced technology. All in the same area. All at the same time. For weeks, Jihu frowned, considering this. You think there is interference? Equipment? Conflicting with other equipment? Maybe. Or maybe the equipment is affecting the environment. Taewon pulled out his datapad and showed Jihu what he had been reading. Look at this. The Western canyons have a specific ecosystem. There is a type of moss that grows in the caves there. Cave moss. The phantom worm feeds on it. The moss is sensitive to high-frequency vibrations. Your scanning equipment operates on high frequencies. You think the scanners killed the moss? I think they disrupted it. And if the moss started dying or stopped growing properly, the worm would have to go somewhere else to find food. It did not disappear. It moved. Jihu stared at him for a long moment. That is remarkably simple. Jihu, remarkably simple. Sometimes problems are simple. We just make them complicated by overthinking. But if the worm moved, where did it go? We have searched the entire preserve. Have you? Taewon pulled up a map of the preserve on his datapad. Look here. The northwestern section. Your maps label it as uninhabited wasteland. Nobody searched there because the charts say nothing lives there, because nothing does live there. The soil is wrong. The water is contaminated. It is useless territory. For most things, yes. But what if the cave moss can grow there? What if that area has the right conditions for the moss, but not for other plants? Everyone assumed wasteland means empty. But maybe it is just empty of things you were looking for. Jihu stood up abruptly. We need to tell the council. They will not listen. Not to me. Then I will tell them. I will say, it is my theory. Taewon shook his head. It may be wrong. I am just guessing based on basic ecology. I could be completely mistaken, but it makes sense. It makes more sense than quantum displacement or temporal phasing. Jihu pulled out his communicator, then paused. Wait. If you are right, you deserve credit. And compensation. I do not need credit. I just want to know if I am right. It has been bothering me. Jihu smiled slightly. You are a strange human, Taewon. Most people would demand recognition. A.T. Friend. Recognition does not fix ships or pay rent. Besides, the hunters would never accept advice from a mechanic. It would embarrass them. Let me propose something, Jihu said. A wager. If you can figure out where the worm went, I will pay you a year's salary. But you have to do it yourself. Go down to the preserve. Find proof. Bring back evidence that cannot be dismissed. Why would you do that? Because I am tired of watching my people fail through arrogance. Because you are the first person in 7 weeks who suggested something logical instead of exotic. And because I want to see if a human mechanic really can outsmart the galaxy's greatest hunters. Taewon considered this. He had accumulated vacation days. Hee-jin had been encouraging him to take time off. And the mystery truly was bothering him. Not knowing if his theory was correct would nag at him for months. All right, he said. I will try. Take 2 days if you need them. I will clear it with your supervisor. They shook hands. Jihu's grip was firm, his hybrid physiology giving him strength beyond human normal. Taewon's hands were still stained with grease. The next morning, Taewon stood in the equipment locker, preparing for his trip to the preserve. He packed light, a flashlight, his multi-tool, a canteen of water, some protein bars, his datapad, a small medical kit, no advanced technology, no weapons, no scanning equipment. Hee-jin found him there. Jihu explained your plan. He said you are going to find the worm. I am going to look for it. That is different from finding it. Why are you doing this? You do not care about hunting. No, Taewon admitted. But I care about fixing problems, And this problem has a solution. I am sure of it. Everyone is just looking in the wrong way. Hyjin studied him for a moment, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small emergency beacon. Take this. If you get in trouble, press it. We will come get you. I will be fine. I am just going for a walk. In a preserve full of dangerous predators, the phantom worm is not aggressive toward humans, and I am not hunting it. I am just observing. Hyjin shook her head but smiled slightly. You are either very brave or very stupid. I have not decided which. Probably stupid, Taewon said cheerfully. But at least I will know. He took the shuttle down to the preserve an hour later. The planet's atmosphere was breathable, though the purple color came from unique plant life that processed light differently than Earth vegetation. The landing zone was busy with hunters preparing for another day of fruitless searching. Taewon avoided them, walking quickly toward the western canyons. He had studied the maps carefully. He knew where he needed to go. The terrain was beautiful in an alien way. Purple trees with silver leaves rustled in the breeze. Red rocks jutted from the ground, like teeth. Strange bird-like creatures flew overhead, their calls echoing across the valleys. Taewon walked steadily, his eyes on the ground. He was not looking for the worm. Not yet. He was looking for evidence that his theory was correct. Evidence that everyone else had been too busy with advanced technology to notice. And after 4 hours of walking, he found it. Growing on the shaded side of a canyon wall was cave moss. But it was dying. Brown patches spread through the green growth, like disease. The moss was struggling, stressed by something in the environment. Taewon knelt and examined it closely. He activated his datapad and took readings with its basic sensor suite. High-frequency vibrations in the area. Residual energy signatures from scanning equipment. The moss was sensitive to these frequencies. The constant bombardment of scanner activity had disrupted its growth cycle. He stood and looked around. If he was a worm, and his food source was dying, where would he go? Where would the moss still be healthy? Away from the hunters. Away from their equipment. Away from the areas they considered important. He pulled up his map and marked the dying moss location. Then he projected a line away from the western canyons, away from the main hunting grounds, toward the northwestern section that everyone had dismissed as worthless. Taewon smiled slightly and started walking. He had a long hike ahead of him. But for the first time in weeks, he felt certain he was moving in the right direction. The walk to the northwestern wasteland took longer than Taewon expected. His map showed it as 5 kilometers from the western canyons, but the terrain was rough and he had to detour around several deep ravines. By the time he reached the boundary of what the preserve charts labeled as uninhabited territory, the purple sun was high overhead and his shirt was soaked with sweat. He paused to drink water and eat a protein bar. Around him, the landscape changed character. The lush purple vegetation gave way to sparser growth. The ground became rockier, with exposed mineral deposits that sparkled in the strange sunlight. The air smelled different here, sharper, with a metallic tang. Taewon understood why the area was labeled wasteland. Most plants could not grow in soil with such high mineral content. Most animals would find no food here. For conventional hunting purposes, this territory was useless. But Taewon was not conventional, and he was not hunting. He knelt and examined the rocks near his feet. Between 2 large boulders, in a shaded crevice, he found what he was looking for. Cave moss. Healthy cave moss, green and thriving, growing thick in the darkness where the mineral-rich soil apparently provided exactly what it needed. Taewon smiled. His theory was holding up. He stood and continued walking, following the moss growth. It appeared sporadically, always in shaded areas, always between rocks or in small caves. The pattern led him deeper into the wasteland, away from any area the hunters had searched. After another hour, he found tracks. They were faint, partially obscured by wind-blown dust, but unmistakable once he noticed them. 3-toed prints, each toe ending in a curved claw. The prints were large, nearly 30 centimeters across. The spacing between them suggested a creature that moved with a strange, gliding gait. Tae-Won pulled out his datapad and compared the tracks to images in the preserved database. Perfect match. Phantom worm tracks. Fresh. No more than a day old. He followed them carefully, his excitement growing despite his attempt to stay calm. The tracks led toward a cluster of hills in the distance, their sides riddled with caves, perfect hiding places for a creature that preferred darkness and cool temperatures. As he walked, Tae-Won thought about the hunters back at the station. They were using million-credit technology, psionic abilities that could sense thoughts across vast distances, scanning equipment that could detect a heartbeat from orbit. All useless because they were looking in the wrong place, making wrong assumptions. Meanwhile, he was following footprints in the dirt, using eyes and common sense. The oldest tracking method in existence. The irony was not lost on him. The hills grew closer. Tae-Won moved more carefully now, aware that he was entering the worm's territory. The creature was not aggressive toward humans, but it was still a predator. Startling it would be stupid. He found more signs of the worm's presence, claw marks on rocks where it had scraped itself clean of parasites, a patch of ground where it had rolled, leaving an impression of its massive body. Droppings, surprisingly small given the creature's size, but identifiable by their unique composition. Everything pointed toward the largest hill, where a cave entrance gaped like a dark mouth in the rock face. The entrance was tall enough for Tae-Won to walk through without ducking. Inside, he could see the gleam of cave moss covering the walls. Tae-Won stopped at the cave entrance. This was the moment of decision. He could go back now, report the location, and let the hunters do their job. That would be the smart choice, the safe choice. But he had come this far, and he needed to be sure. He pulled out his flashlight and stepped into the cave. The temperature dropped immediately. The cave was cool and damp, with water dripping somewhere deeper inside. The moss glowed faintly, providing just enough light to see by even without the flashlight. The air smelled organic, rich with the scent of growing things and animal musk. Tae-Won moved slowly, making no unnecessary noise. His boots scraped softly on the stone floor. His breathing seemed loud in the enclosed space. He swept his flashlight across the cave walls, seeing more moss, some mineral formations, and the occasional small creature scurrying away from the light. The cave curved to the right. Tae-Won followed it, one hand trailing along the wall for balance. The passage widened into a larger chamber, and there, he stopped. The phantom worm lay in the center of the chamber. It was magnificent, 3 meters long from nose to tail tip, with a body that seemed to shift between solid and liquid as it breathed. Its scales were indeed bioluminescent, currently dim but still visible, creating patterns of light that moved across its skin, like slow lightning. The creature's head was wedge-shaped, with large eyes that were closed in sleep. Its 3-toed feet were tucked beneath its body. Tae-Won stood very still, barely breathing. He had found it, the creature that had eluded the galaxy's greatest hunters for 7 weeks. It was right here, sleeping peacefully in a cave that nobody had bothered to search because the charts said this area was worthless. Slowly, careful not to make sudden movements, Tae-Won raised his datapad and took a photograph. The device's camera was not high quality, but it was sufficient. The image clearly showed the worm, the cave, and enough detail to prove this was not some other creature. He took 3 more photos from different angles, then checked the coordinate system on his datapad. The location was recorded automatically with each image. Perfect. He had his proof. The worm stirred slightly in its sleep, and Tae-Won froze. The creature's eyes opened halfway, revealing inner lids that reflected his flashlight beam with an eerie green glow. For a long moment, predator and human stared at each other. Then the worm's eyes closed again. It shifted position slightly, getting more comfortable, and resumed sleeping. Tae-Won released a breath he had not realized he was holding. The worm was not threatened by him. Why would it be? He was not hunting it. He carried no weapons. He was just a human standing in a cave, taking pictures. He backed away slowly, retracing his steps through the passage. Only when he emerged into the purple daylight did he allow himself to relax. His hands were shaking slightly from adrenaline, but he was grinning. 6 hours. He had been on the preserve for 6 hours, and in that time, using nothing but a flashlight, a multi-tool, and basic observation skills, he had accomplished what the galaxy's greatest hunters could not manage in 7 weeks. The walk back to the landing zone took 3 hours. Taewon moved faster now, energized by success. His mind was already working through how to explain his findings. The dying moss in the western canyons, the correlation with scanner frequencies, the migration pattern following the food source, the overlooked territory that nobody thought to search. It all made sense when you thought about it logically. The worm had not developed exotic abilities. It had not achieved quantum displacement or temporal phasing. It had simply moved to find food, as any animal would. The hunter's own technology had disrupted the ecosystem, driving their prey away without them realizing it. And because they trusted their advanced equipment more than basic observation, because they assumed their maps were complete and accurate, because they thought in terms of complex solutions instead of simple causes, they had missed the obvious answer. Taewon reached the landing zone as the purple sun began to set. The shuttle that had brought him down was still there, waiting. He climbed aboard and signaled the pilot that he was ready to return to the station. During the flight up, Taewon reviewed the photos on his datapad. They were clear enough. Undeniable. The phantom worm existed. He knew where it was. He had proof. Now came the hard part. Convincing the hunters to listen to him. The shuttle docked at the station 40 minutes later. Taewon headed immediately to find Ji-Hoo. He checked the cantina first, then the observation deck, finally locating the young hybrid in the docking bay. Surprisingly enough, watching Haejin coordinate the evening's ship maintenance schedule. Ji-Hoo, Taewon called. The hybrid turned, his expression curious. Taewon held up his datapad. I found it. The worm. I know where it is. Ji-Hoo's eyes widened. You are serious. Completely serious. Look. Taewon showed him the photographs. Ji-Hoo stared at the images, his expression cycling through disbelief, amazement, and something that might have been respect. By the ancestors, he breathed. You actually did it. You found the worm in 6 hours. More like 5 hours of walking and 1 hour of looking. The hard part was not finding it. The hard part was realizing where to look. The council must see this immediately. Come on. Will they listen? They will have no choice. You have proof. Undeniable. Photographic proof. Ji-Hoo grabbed Taewon's arm and pulled him toward the observation deck. This is going to be incredible. Do you realize what you have done? I solved a problem. That is all. You solved a problem that stumped the greatest minds in the galaxy. There is a difference. They reached the observation deck where the Hunt Council was in session, as it had been almost constantly for the past week. The hunters looked tired, frustrated, and angry. Several were arguing about whose fault the failure was. Ji-Hoo strode into the room without announcing himself. Council members, he said loudly, interrupting an argument between Kriegsvalor and Bolthun. I have news. The phantom worm has been found. Every head turned. The room fell silent. Kriegsvalor's crystalline face reflected the room's lights as he focused on Ji-Hoo. What did you say? The worm has been located. We know exactly where it is. Ji-Hoo gestured to Taewon, who had followed him into the room. Taewon found it. He has proof. Worm find. Taewon. 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 Every eye in the room turned to the mechanic in his oil-stained coveralls, still dusty from his hike through the preserve. Taewon wished very much that he could be anywhere else. But he had started this. He needed to finish it. He held up his datapad. I have photographs, he said quietly. And coordinates. The worm is alive and healthy in the northwestern wasteland. I saw it myself, less than 3 hours ago. The silence in the observation deck lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Then, everyone started talking at once. Impossible, Crix Valor said, his voice cutting through the noise. You checked maps, Taewon replied, keeping his voice calm. Maps written by people who were looking for certain types of life. They found none, so they labeled it Wasteland. But nobody checked to see if different types of life might thrive there. Show us these photographs, Bolthun demanded, his 6 arms crossed skeptically. Taewon handed his datapad to Jihu, who connected it to the observation deck's main display screen. The images appeared on the large screen, clear and undeniable. The phantom worm, sleeping in its cave, its bioluminescent scales creating patterns of light across its body. The room erupted again. Hunters crowded around the screen, examining the images from every angle. Several pulled out their own devices, analyzing the photographs for signs of manipulation or fakery. The metadata confirms these were taken today, one hunter announced. 3 hours ago, to be precise. The coordinates place them in the northwestern section of the preserve, exactly where he claims. But how? Nemsha floated closer to Taewon, her psionic presence washing over him like a wave. We searched everywhere. How did we miss an entire region? You dismissed it, Taewon said simply. Your maps said it was wasteland, so you assumed nothing could live there. But the worm does not need the same environment as most creatures. It feeds primarily on cave moss. And cave moss grows very well in mineral-rich soil, even though most other plants cannot. Why would the worm be in that region at all? Another hunter asked. It has always stayed in the western canyons. That has been its territory for decades. Not anymore. Taewon pulled up his datapad's notes, projecting data onto the screen beside the photographs. The moss in the western canyons is dying. I found extensive dead patches there. The moss is sensitive to high-frequency vibrations. Your scanning equipment has been bombarding the area with high frequencies for 7 weeks. You disrupted the moss's growth cycle. Without its primary food source, the worm had no choice but to migrate. Bolthun's perfect memory was already cross-referencing information. He is correct about the moss sensitivity. That is documented in the ecological surveys. And we have been using sonic disruptors, gravimetric scanners, and psionic amplifiers constantly, all of which emit high-frequency energy waves. Our own equipment drove the worm away, another hunter said slowly, realization dawning on his face. We were causing the very problem we were trying to solve. 50. R. The equipment malfunctions make sense now too, Jihu added. All that scanning equipment operating simultaneously created interference patterns. The false readings were not the worm jamming our sensors. We were jamming ourselves. Well, also, Crix Valor had been silent during this exchange, his crystalline face unreadable. Now he spoke, his voice cold. This is absurd. You expect us to believe that a simple mechanic solved in hours what we could not accomplish in weeks? I do not expect you to believe anything, Taewon said quietly. I am just reporting what I found. You can verify it yourself. The coordinates are right there. Send someone to check. It could be luck, Crix Valor insisted. A fortunate accident. Perhaps you simply stumbled upon the creature during a random walk. Then why did you not stumble upon it? Jihu asked sharply. You had dozens of hunters, unlimited resources, and weeks of time. If it was pure luck, surely one of you would have gotten lucky eventually. Watch your tone, hybrid, Crix Valor warned. I will not. You are embarrassed. I understand that. But embarrassment is no excuse for dismissing clear evidence. Jihu gestured at the screen. He found the worm. The question is not whether he was lucky. The question is, what you are going to do about it. Nemsha had been silent, but now she floated forward. The coordinates are accurate. I can sense the worm's presence now, that I know where to look. It is exactly where the human says it is. The creature's mind is calm, untroubled. It is not hiding or afraid. It is simply living in a location we did not think to search. That statement seemed to break the remaining resistance. Hunters began talking among themselves, planning a capture operation. Some looked excited, others looked embarrassed. A few looked angry. Bolthun approached Taewon directly. "Explain your methodology. How did you determine where to search?" Taewon explained, step by step. Looking at the ecosystem rather than the creature. Checking for environmental changes. Following the moss growth pattern. Questioning assumptions about what made land valuable or worthwhile. Thinking like a mechanic instead of a hunter. "I was not trying to find the worm," he concluded. "I was trying to understand why your methods were not working. Once I understood that, finding the worm became simple. It went where the food was, like any animal would." "Simple," Bolthun repeated, almost to himself. "Yes, remarkably simple. We made it complicated, because we are complicated thinkers. We looked for complex solutions because we assumed the problem was complex. Most problems are simple," Taewon said. "They just look complicated when you are too close to them, or when you use complicated tools that create their own problems." More hunters approached, asking questions. How long had he been on the preserve? What equipment had he used? Had he been afraid approaching the worm alone? Did he have tracking experience? Taewon answered each question honestly. No special equipment, no tracking experience. Yes, he had been a bit afraid, but the worm was known to be non-aggressive toward humans if unprovoked. He had simply walked carefully and kept his distance. "But why?" one hunter asked. "Why did you care enough to do this? You are not a hunter. The prize money means nothing to you. Why spend your free time solving our problem?" Taewon considered the question. "Because it bothered me," he said finally. "I knew there had to be an explanation. I kept thinking about it while I worked. It was like having a machine that would not run properly. I needed to understand what was wrong with it. The worm was the machine, in a way. Or rather, the situation was the machine. It was broken. I wanted to fix it." "A mechanic's mindset," Jihu said, smiling. "He cannot leave things broken, even things that are not his responsibility. Especially things that are not his responsibility," Heijin added. She had entered the observation deck at some point and was watching from the doorway. Taewon has always been like that. He once spent 3 days fixing the station's water recycler during his vacation time because the sound it made bothered him. Several hunters laughed at that. The tension in the room was easing. Even those who had been angry or embarrassed were beginning to accept what had happened, but not Crick's valor. The Velthari huntmaster stood rigid, his crystalline body practically vibrating with suppressed emotion. "This proves nothing, AM," he said coldly. "Finding the creature is only half the task. Capturing it is what matters. We will complete the hunt properly, using proper techniques and proper equipment." "Of course," Taewon agreed. "I was never trying to capture it. I just wanted to know where it was. Then your part in this is finished. You may return to your work." The dismissal was clear. Taewon nodded and turned to leave. Jihu caught his arm. "Wait! You have earned compensation. And recognition. I do not need either. I was just curious." Nevertheless, Jihu pulled out a credit chip and pressed it into Taewon's hand. "A year's salary, as promised. You earned it. I cannot accept. You can and you will. You solved an impossible problem. That deserves reward." Jihu smiled. "Besides, I want to see Crick's Valor's face when the record shows a human mechanic received the finder's fee." Despite himself, Taewon smiled slightly. He left the observation deck, still holding the credit chip, feeling strange. He had accomplished something remarkable. He knew that intellectually, but emotionally, it still felt like he had just solved a simple problem. Find the food. Find the animal. Basic logic. Behind him, the hunters were already organizing the capture operation. With the worm's location known, the actual capture would be straightforward. They had the equipment, the expertise, and the numbers. They would succeed, now. But they would always know that it took a mechanic to show them where to look. Taewon returned to his quarters, cleaned up, and tried to sleep. His mind was too active. He kept thinking about the look on Crick's Valor's face, the mixture of disbelief and anger and grudging respect from the other hunters. The weight of the credit chip in his pocket. He had never wanted fame or recognition. He just fixed things. That was what he did. That was what made sense to him. But tomorrow, when word of this spread through the station, everything would be different. People would look at him differently. Expect things from him. Ask him to solve other problems. Taewon stared at the ceiling of his small quarters and wondered if he had made a mistake by speaking up. Life had been simpler when he was invisible, but then he remembered the phantom worm, sleeping peacefully in its cave, unaware that it had become the center of a galactic incident. It had not done anything wrong or complicated. It had just moved to find food when its original food source became unsuitable. Simple cause, simple effect, simple solution. Maybe that was the lesson here. Not that humans were smarter or better than other species, but that sometimes the simple approach worked when complicated methods failed. That sometimes asking basic questions was more valuable than having advanced answers. Taewon smiled in the darkness. Tomorrow, the hunters would capture the worm. They would claim their prize and their glory. The centennial great hunt would be declared a success, and he would go back to fixing ships. Some things, he decided, should stay simple. The next morning, Taewon woke to find his communicator flooded with messages. 17 interview requests from galactic news networks. 9 offers from hunting guilds, wanting to hire him as a consultant. 3 invitations to speak at universities, and 1 message from Heejin telling him he was late for work. He ignored everything except the last one. 20 minutes later, he was back in the docking bay wearing his usual oil-stained coveralls, ready to repair a transport ship's malfunctioning cargo door. But the station had changed overnight. As Taewon walked through the corridors, people stared. Some pointed. A few tried to approach him for autographs or pictures. He walked faster, keeping his head down, uncomfortable with the attention. The docking bay was his sanctuary. Here, at least, things were normal. Ships needed fixing. Work needed doing. Heejin handed him his assignment without fanfare. "You are famous now," she said matter-of-factly. "Terrible. I just want to work." "Too bad. The reporters are already here. Station administration is setting up a press conference this afternoon. You are expected to attend." Taewon groaned. "I do not want a press conference. I found a lost animal. That is all. You embarrassed the galaxy's greatest hunters, made them look foolish. Proved that humans can think differently. That is news, whether you like it or not." Down on the preserve, the capture operation was underway. With the worm's location known, the hunters moved efficiently. They surrounded the cave system, set up containment fields, used careful sedation techniques to ensure the creature was not harmed. 4 hours after they began, the phantom worm was safely contained in a specialized transport chamber. The bioluminescent creature would be studied, its unique enzymes harvested humanely, and then it would be released back into a suitable habitat. The hunt was successful. But the celebrations were muted. Everyone knew the truth. They had not found the worm through skill or technology. They had been told where it was by a mechanic who used nothing but common sense. Crick's Valor stood before the press, his crystalline face arranged in what might have been a smile. "The centennial great hunt is complete," he announced. "The phantom worm has been successfully captured. This was a team effort requiring the skills and dedication of hunters from across the galaxy." The reporters asked the obvious question: what about the human mechanic who actually found the creature? Crick's Valor's expression hardened slightly. Tae-won provided valuable information that assisted in the final stages of the hunt. We acknowledge his contribution. But he found it in 6 hours after you searched for 7 weeks. The hunt is not merely about finding prey. It is about the skill of the chase, the mastery of technique, the honor of the pursuit. So you are saying finding the animal quickly is somehow less impressive than searching for it inefficiently for weeks? Crick's Valor ended the press conference shortly after that. Tae-won's press conference was scheduled for 2 hours later. He tried to avoid it, but Ji-hoo found him hiding in a maintenance closet and dragged him out. You have to do this, Ji-hoo insisted. You represent something important. I represent someone who wants to be left alone. You represent humanity's approach to problem solving. You showed that humans think differently. That difference has value. People need to see that. The press conference was held in the station's main auditorium. Tae-won sat at a table on the stage, feeling exposed under the bright lights. Hundreds of beings from dozens of species filled the seats, all staring at him. Cameras recorded everything. The questions came fast. How did he figure out where to look? What made him think to check the ecosystem instead of the creature? Did he have special training? What was his secret? Tae-won answered honestly. There is no secret. I just looked at the problem differently. The hunters were trying to find the worm. I was trying to understand why they could not find it. Once I understood that their equipment was disrupting the environment, the rest was simple. Follow the food source. Check the areas nobody thought to search. But why did you think to do that when the experts did not? Tae-won considered the question carefully. Because I am not an expert. Experts know a lot about their field. That is good. But sometimes knowing too much makes you think in specific patterns. You expect certain answers. You use certain methods. When those do not work, you try more complicated versions of the same methods. And your method was different? My method was simpler. I fix machines for a living. When a machine breaks, I do not assume it developed quantum abilities or achieved dimensional transcendence. I check the basic parts first. Is there power? Are the connections tight? Is something blocking the normal function? Usually the problem is simple. People just overlook it because they expect complications. One reporter asked, "Do you think humans are smarter than other species?" No, definitely not. Other species are far more intelligent than humans in many ways. The Kravik have perfect memory. The Velthari can process information faster than any human. The psionics can sense things we cannot imagine. Tae-won paused. But intelligence is not the same as perspective. Humans are good at adapting. We come from a world where we had no special advantages. No claws, no armor, no psionic abilities. We survived by being flexible, by using tools, by thinking around problems instead of through them. So humanity's advantage is adaptability? Maybe. Or maybe it is that we are used to being the least impressive species in the room. We do not expect to be the smartest, or strongest, or most talented. So we try different approaches. We ask simple questions. We are not afraid to look stupid by suggesting obvious answers. The reporters loved that. Within hours, his words were being broadcast across the galaxy. Not afraid to look stupid became a catchphrase. Ask simple questions became a meme. Tae-won hated all of it. But something else was happening too. Messages started coming in from across the galaxy. Stories from other humans who had solved problems that experts could not. A human janitor on Proxima Station had fixed a critical recycling system that engineers had declared unfixable. The problem? Someone had set the wrong schedule. The system was trying to process waste at the wrong time of day. Simple solution that everyone overlooked because they were busy analyzing the complex mechanical systems. A human cook on a colony world had solved a food shortage crisis. The problem? The colonists were trying to grow earth crops in alien soil, using advanced hydroponic systems. The cook suggested rotating crops like farmers had done for thousands of years. Yields increased by 40%. A human teacher had resolved a diplomatic deadlock between two alien species. The problem? Both species thought they were discussing the same concept, but they were using translation software that did not account for cultural context. The teacher asked them to define their terms clearly. The misunderstanding dissolved immediately. The pattern was clear. Humans were solving problems all across the galaxy, not through superior technology or intelligence, but through practical thinking and willingness to question assumptions. Over the next few weeks, the story spread. Academic papers were written. The human problem-solving approach became a legitimate field of study. Universities started teaching courses on simplification methodologies and assumption-challenging techniques. Taewon ignored all of it. He returned to work, grateful when the attention finally died down enough that he could walk through the station without being stopped. 3 months after the Phantom Worm incident, a new group of hunters arrived at the station. They were tracking something called a shadow stalker, a creature that could supposedly become invisible. They had been searching for 6 weeks with no success. Taewon was repairing a shuttle's landing struts when they arrived. He heard them discussing their problem in the cantina next door. They had used every detection method available: thermal imaging, motion sensors, psionic sweeps, gravimetric analysis. Nothing worked. Taewon paused in his work, listening despite himself. The hunters sounded frustrated, describing how the creature kept appearing and disappearing without pattern or logic. They had analyzed hundreds of sightings, trying to predict where it would appear next. He pulled out his datapad and looked up shadow stalkers. The creature was nocturnal. It hunted small prey. It was most active during the planet's 12-hour night cycle. Taewon frowned. The hunters were tracking it during the day, setting up elaborate detection grids and sensor networks. But if the creature was nocturnal and hiding during the day, all that equipment would be useless. They were looking at the wrong time. He set down his tools and wiped his hands on his coveralls. Then he shook his head and picked the tools back up. He had learned his lesson. The hunters would figure it out eventually. It was not his problem. But Haejin appeared beside him, arms crossed. "It is not my business. It bothers you, though. I can tell. You have that look. The same look you had before. You went to find the worm. I am staying out of it." "Why?" "Because you are afraid of attention? That is a waste of your abilities." "I do not have abilities. I just think about things logically." Abi. Exactly. And that is valuable. More valuable than you realize. Haejin pointed toward the cantina. Those hunters will waste weeks searching, maybe months. Or you could tell them what they are doing wrong and save them time. Why is that so difficult? Taewon was quiet for a long moment. Because I am just a mechanic. I fix ships. That is what I am good at. No. You fix problems. Ships are just one kind of problem. Haejin softened her tone. You do not have to be famous. You do not have to give interviews or write papers. But you can help people when you see them struggling with simple mistakes. That is not showing off. That is just being decent. She left him to think about it. Taewon returned to his work on the landing struts. But his mind was elsewhere. The shadow stalker problem was bothering him. He knew the answer. It was obvious. The hunters were searching during the day for a nocturnal creature. They needed to set up their sensors at night and check the data in the morning. Simple solution, simple problem. But they would not see it because they were busy using complicated equipment and complex tracking algorithms. That evening, as his shift ended, Taewon walked to the cantina. The hunters were still there, arguing about sensor placement and detection frequencies. He approached their table quietly. "Excuse me," he said. They turned. One of them recognized him. "You are the mechanic. The one who found the worm." "Yes. I am sorry to interrupt, but I think I know why you cannot find the shadow stalker." The hunters exchanged glances. Then, surprisingly, they invited him to sit down. "Tell us," their leader said. "We will listen," Tae-won explained. The nocturnal nature of their prey, the timing of their searches, the simple solution of checking different hours. It took less than 5 minutes. The hunters sat in silence for a moment. Then their leader started laughing. Of course. We were searching during the day. The creature is asleep during the day. Hidden and inactive. We would never find it." He looked at Tae-won with something like wonder. "How do you do this? How do you see these things so clearly?" "I do not know. I just ask simple questions. When are they active? Where do they live? What do they need? Then I think about whether the current approach matches those answers. Can we hire you as a consultant? No. But you can ask me questions if you see me around. I will answer if I can." No. He left them planning a new strategy, feeling strangely satisfied. He had helped, not for fame or money, just because he could, just because it felt wrong to watch people struggle with simple problems. Over the next year, it became routine. Hunters would arrive, struggle with tracking something, and eventually, someone would suggest asking the mechanic. Tae-won would listen, think about it, and offer suggestions. Sometimes he was right. Sometimes he was wrong. But he was right often enough that his reputation grew despite his attempts to stay anonymous. He never stopped being a mechanic. He still fixed ships every day, his hands perpetually stained with grease and oil. But now he also fixed other problems when people asked nicely. 5 years after the Phantom Worm incident, a journalist asked Tae-won for an interview about humanity's role in the galaxy. He almost refused, but the journalist promised it would be small and quiet, not broadcast widely. They met in a small cafe on the station. The journalist was human. A young woman named Da-eun, who specialized in cultural studies. "Why do you think humans are good at solving these problems?" she asked. Tae-won thought about it while sipping his coffee. "Because we have no choice. Every other species has something special, something they are naturally good at. Humans have nothing but flexibility. We had to learn to adapt, or we would have died out. So we became very good at looking at problems from different angles, at trying new approaches, at not being too proud to suggest simple answers." Do you think that makes humanity important to the galactic community? Important? No. Useful? Maybe. Everyone brings something different. The Velthari bring processing speed. The Kravik bring perfect memory. The psionics bring perception beyond the physical. Humans bring flexibility and simple thinking. All of it matters. All of it helps. You are very humble about your achievements. Tae-won smiled slightly. I have not achieved anything. I just fix things that are broken. Anyone could do it, if they were willing to ask simple questions and ignore their own pride. The interview was published in a small academic journal. It was never broadcast widely. Tae-won liked it that way. He continued working, fixing ships, solving simple problems, living quietly in the vast galaxy that was slowly learning that sometimes the smartest solution was the simplest one, and that humanity's greatest strength was not what they could build or discover, but how they thought when faced with something they did not understand. They adapted. They questioned. They tried simple answers first, and more often than anyone expected, those simple answers worked.